All right, welcome everybody. We have a few more minutes before we're going to get started. Just to be patient here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Nick Kramer, and I will be your facilitator for this webinar today on scaling Agile. And what we're going to talk about in this webinar is some challenges that we see organizations have and some of the various tools, tricks, techniques, and frameworks that you can use to overcome some of these challenges. Okay. So like I said, my name is Nick Kramer. Here's a picture of me. This is also a picture of my happy place in Key West, Florida that I just got home from. I go every year for the last 14 or 15 years for about a week, and I'm super excited. So I just had to share this picture. For those of you that are in a snowy place, I apologize. I've been doing Agile training and coaching for about 10 years now. I started off in the healthcare industry, working with one of the Blue Cross Blue Shield affiliates. I helped them go through a transformation, and since then I've worked with many large organizations as well as several startups trying to figure out how to scale, which is interesting, working with startups that determine they need to scale right from the beginning. So that's always an interesting prospect. Now, just a quick reminder here, this webinar is scheduled to last until the top of the hour. I'm not sure if it's going to take that long for sure. I'm also going to be dropping some information into the handout section today of your the webinar screen. The first thing I'm going to drop in is a case study that I just received from Dr. Sutherland. I'm not sure if everybody knows who Dr. Sutherland is. He is one of the founders of Scrum, and I just happened to be on a call with him earlier today, and he gave me this case study that is really good on how some organizations have been scaling Agile, and this is one for particularly Rocket Mortgage. So I'm going to share that with you right now. Give me, sorry, just 1 second here. No, honestly, I'm going to share it right now. Technology, isn't that fun? There you go. I encourage you to look at it. Rocket Mortgage has done a lot of analysis on their implementation of Scrum at Scale, which is one of the frameworks that we sell here at WebAge, and they believe that they are gaining twice the efficiency at half the cost. So it's worth definitely reading. If you have a moment, go ahead and download that and read it. All right. So first of all, I've turned off the muting functionality so everybody can mute. If you wouldn't mind, I would be very curious if you want to put it here or in the chat section of the webinar. What are some of the pain points that your organization currently is struggling with, whether it's scaling or not? I'm just curious, what are some of the pain points that we all are suffering with? So we can just take yourself off mute and let's share. Or drop it in the chat. Anybody have some thoughts? And if you want to share, just drop it in the question section. That'll work just fine of the webinar section. All right, the first one has come in, and it is Scrum at Scale is not being done consistently throughout the enterprise. Yes, this is a very common pain point that we have, and we are going to talk about this pain point in particularly a little bit here as we go. Excellent one. SoSoS, Scrum at Scale is not being done consistently throughout the enterprise. Yes, Dependencies across team. Yeah, I would say this is probably the root of most pain points that I see and that we see when we go out to see clients. They have a hard time with almost everything comes back to dependency management, communication, bureaucracy, dealing with impediments, right? Even the inconsistency ones that we just mentioned before, all kind of relate around how are we going to, work with dependencies. If teams aren't working in a consistent manner, then working through dependencies can definitely be an issue. Excellent. Organization not ready. Yes, for sure. This is one that I see also a lot. Good one, Diane. We see that organizations think they need to scale for whatever reason. Some executive, some manager went to some webinar like this and they say, hey, the answer to our problem is scaling. We got to scale. And then we fail to address the underlying issues that are out there. So yes, that's another great one. Thank you. All right. If you want to keep adding them throughout the chat, throughout the webinar, please add them. And if you have questions that you'd like to share, drop them in the questions, or of course, you can just take yourself off mute and ask the questions. So let's start the webinar here. Let's talk about why do we want to scale? Okay, there are really 3 reasons why organizations scale. And I'm sure we can think of more, but these are the top 3 that I always think of. The first one is we have multiple teams working on the same product. In this case, many teams have to coordinate to deliver one consistent deliverable for one product. And the challenges of working together facilitate the need to scale. The second reason organizations often scale is they have multiple agile teams working on different products. This is when we're more in a siloed work environment or where teams are set up in such a way that we need to coordinate delivery. Like we might have a DevOps team that coordinates the implementation. We have a testing team that delivers this, or we have a component-based team where we have the team that works on the payment system is working over here, and then we have teams that are working on the fulfillments over here, or we have teams that work on the claims processing. And in order to deliver an overall product, we need to coordinate across all of those different teams. And then lastly, the reasons why organizations often scale is to create a cultural change within the organization, to make a shift, an agile shift, to create an agile mindset across a large organization. So these are the top 3 reasons that I hear organizations scale. Now, there are 4 different basic types of scaling mechanisms that we can use. The first one is a product scaling mechanism. This is where we have multiple teams working on one product. This is a pretty common way. Most organizations that are scaling effectively are moving towards a product mindset. And so this is becoming the most popular one. The second one, is a platform type of scaling where we have multiple products that are feeding into one platform or suite of stuff that we need to coordinate the delivery across the suite. Now, when I worked in the healthcare industry at the Blue Cross Blue Shield, we were in more of a platform mode because we had so many different products that needed to release at the exact same time in order to make things work correctly across, the entire portfolio of what we were working with there. However, ideally we would have moved towards a more product mindset where each individual product could release independently, but we were in a platform type scaling model. The other one is a horizontal model. Now, this is a model where you have different departments and different sectors of the organization that need to work closely together. IT has to work with HR, or IT works with the sales department. IT works with any other departments. Right? This is when departments start working together to deliver the products. Instead of throwing over something to the HR department, we work and coordinate with them. I'm going to give you a case study at the end of this webinar where we did some horizontal scaling with the sales department in order to effectively deliver on our product. And then lastly, there's vertical scaling, where you have multiple verticals in a large organization that need to coordinate together. Now, these don't always work in a vacuum. And very oftentimes you'll be in a product mindset and delivering horizontally. That's the example I'm going to give you later today. You might also have, platform type scaling that is working across multiple verticals. So you don't necessarily have to fit yourself into a box, but if any one of these kind of rings a bell for you, then you might need to scale. You might need to scale. Now, scaling in a nutshell really comes down to this. We have work items coming from many different locations and organizations. They come from product owners and sponsors and customers. They come from production support departments, right? They come from requests from internal and external. And all of these requests feed into some sort of backlog. Now, this might be one backlog or multiple backlogs. Once we have those requests, then we need to coordinate across multiple teams to create some sort of delivery. Now, this is what scaling is. It's the coordination across the different teams that is creating the delivery. And this is where things get interesting and where we can start to have problems or opportunities, I should say. I should warn you that there is no prescription for scaling. Every company is going to do it different. Every company has different cultures. We all use different tools. We all have different goals. And so there is no exact prescription. There is no magic bullet. Any organization that you go to and start looking at framework, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments here, if they tell you, oh, you have to use SAFe, it's the only way, you have to do it this way, then I would not use that company, right? If you start using Scrum at Scale and that particular vendor or your consultants or coaches say, got to do it this way. No, that's not the way. It really is, there is no prescription. So you're going to have to take a little bit of each piece of them and work and adapt it to what works to your organization. And remember, my big pro tip here is don't scale if you don't need to, right? If you don't have to scale, don't. Right, creates a certain layer of bureaucracy. It creates a much more heavy dependency management. It creates much more time. There's much more cost in all of these things. So if you can find ways of coordinating your teams or to deliver your products and services without implementing a scaled agile approach, I would highly recommend that. And there are ways, and it's called descaling in the industry. There are ways to descale by, say, organizing your teams in a different way, or creating different mechanisms for delivery of your services through DevOps and these kinds of things. So there are lots of ways that we can actually descale your organization. Good point, Richard says in the question says, he always says, nail it before you scale it. And he is going to get the big prize here for just a moment, because that's what we're going to talk about. So thank you. All right. So organizations struggle to scale Agile for lots of reasons. And I listed off some more here that they can't prioritize, right? It becomes a huge battle between what's the number one priority, who wins, right? We only have so much capacity, and it becomes a giant battle over prioritization, right? It also becomes difficult because we can't deliver. We have too many tools. We have too many processes. We have too big of a bureaucracy in place that we can't deliver. We're just jumping through too many hoops, right? Or that we can't refactor the organizations. I see so many organizations that think they need to scale, and they start the scaling process, and they maybe put the teams in a particular structure, but then they're not willing to rethink management. They're not willing to think processes and tools and all of these things. They do a superficial change without diving into the hard issues, right? And then they're not willing to, like I said, change the culture. It really becomes a mindset shift once you start to do more and more transformation. Now, here you might be all familiar with the State of Agile survey. Oh, I noticed there's actually a 15th survey here out, but these are some of the reasons, top reasons organizations claim that they're having difficulty scaling. You can see here, there are several here. I'm sure many of these ring your bell. Okay, so one of the key things I want to talk about is this leadership style when we have to we start scaling. In traditional project management, we have a very command and control structure. We're all familiar with command and control, I hope, right? It's when the management says, this is how we're going to do it, and then it all rolls downhill to the team. Once we start to go into a more agile mindset and we allow our teams to start using Scrum and Kanban, we move into sometimes this thought process of a command of teams, meaning we allow the teams to be independent a little, but we're still out there kind of dictating what they do within reason, right? Where we put lots of guardrails around what the team can and can't do, how they communicate with each other, and this can lead to, this is a great first step when you're doing an agile transformation or you're doing scaling. But in order to get a full scaled framework into place, you're going to have to move to more of a team of teams where we allow the teams to do the coordination. We allow the people of the teams, whether that be Scrum Masters, product owners, developers, to coordinate amongst themselves, to build processes that work for them. Now, this can be very complicated. It can be very time consuming to build this cultural mindset. And more importantly, is very difficult sometimes for management to give up this control, to give over faith to the teams. So in order to really get to a true scaled implementation, we need to get to more of this team of teams leadership approach. Okay. Remember, scaling a broken system doesn't work. If we can't organize, and that's what we were just talking about in the question that came up in the chat, if we can't organize, allow our teams to see the problems, fix the problems, and to help the teams out, then we're not going to get anywhere. So that's the first thing. We need to nail it before we scale it. I love it. I'm going to steal that. All right. One of the first challenges that we see once we start to scale is we see a challenge of communication overload. Right? When two people communicate, it's pretty easy to keep things straight. When multiple people inside of a team start to coordinate, it can be a challenge to make sure every member of the team is on the same page, right? But once we start to implement multiple teams, as we saw back here on this chart here, the communication can become a massive overload if we're not careful. So this is one of the first things that we need to think about is this challenge of communication overload. Okay, and we'll talk more about this as we continue to go. But the scaling challenges, the first challenge I see is inconsistent Scrum. So it's very difficult for teams and organizations to scale when they can't get it right at the team level. Right? Each team is working with a different version of Scrum. Each team is making up their own rules. Each team, has their own way of dealing with things. Now, each team should be allowed to be independent and cross-functional, but there should be a single reference model that organizations use to identify how Scrum is implemented inside of your teams. This gives us a common language to work from. It gives us a common communication platform. Right? It creates a common culture across the organization. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we are getting Scrum right at the team level. Now, right for your organization might be different than right from my organization, but we definitely want to make sure that we are getting it right, getting it consistent. Now, if you are having issues with Scrum, I would remind you to look at the Scrum Guide, which recently just got updated, and I'm going to drop the latest version of the Scrum Guide into the webinar panel there. If you'd like to download that, please, it's great. Or you can download that from the internet also. Now, Scrum Teams, right? We're all familiar with how Scrum Teams should look, and we want to make sure that our teams are adhering to the Scrum values and principles and practices whenever possible, right? So we want to focus on this Scrum team. We also want to focus on the Scrum methodology, right? Creating a proper, consistent backlog, having effective sprint plannings, doing daily scrums correctly, making sure that we have sprint reviews, demos, and retrospectives, these kinds of things. So we want to make sure that at the team level, they have this consistent reference model that they are using. Then, once we start to have consistency across the team, then we can start to think about a framework that we're going to use. And remember, it's not the framework that's going to be the problem in the long run. It's not that SAFe is going to cause issues. It's not that Scrum at Scale is going to cause issues, or less, or DAD. It is the implementation of those. It's the common reference model. It's the principles and practices that we need to look at that will make sure they work for our teams, right? We want to create this common vocabulary and a minimal viable bureaucracy, which, as a term I have recently heard about in the last couple of years, which I really like. We want to make sure that we have as little bureaucracy as possible. Common frameworks and shared practices, right? We want to make sure that we are creating communities. All right. So let's talk about a couple of the frameworks that we can use. The first one is SAFe. SAFe is a very common methodology that addresses a lot of the problems that organizations have in Scaled. You can see by looking at this chart, it's very complicated. I sometimes call it an eye chart because your eyes start to cross when you look at it, which is interesting. And we're not going to talk specifically about SAFe too much. I just want you to be aware that when you start to scale, you might want to do some research and look at some of the things that SAFe says. You might want to implement SAFe as a base and then start tweaking it where necessary, or you might use one of the other frameworks and add common practices from SAFe. So the first one is SAFe. The second one is LESS, is another very common framework. This one is particularly common in Europe. So if you do any work in Europe, you might hear about this one, but it has some great concepts that I borrow a lot from when I'm doing transformations. There's one called Discipline Agile Delivery, or DAD, which is also super popular. Becoming super popular, it's now part of the PMI family, the Product Management Institute, so you could look in that one. And then the fourth one is the Scrum at Scale model, right? This is the one that I like to use the most, only because it's lightweight and it works very simply, and it focuses on the beginning of a transformation, and then I start to bolt in the other components of SAFe and LESS and those kinds of things. Now you'll notice that in that Rocket Mortgage case study that I just dropped in there, they talk about how they use Scrum at Scale and SAFe at the same time in order to create maximum efficiency in their organization. So it is very common to implement both of them at the same time. But when you're looking at any one of these models, you're going to want to make sure that you're discussing the how versus the what. And this gets commonly confused when we start working with organizations. Right, the how is what the team is doing and how they're doing it, and the what is the product owner cycle, and the ones how we're going to organize work and decide on priority. Yes, there is other methodologies I see in the questions here out there that you can also look up. Someone just pointed out there's one called Nexus, which I am not too familiar with, but I know that it is, a lot of people use it. So my apologies, I don't mean to skip other frameworks. There are lots of them. I'm sure if you know other frameworks, drop them into the questions section. All right. One of the things that we want to watch out for when we are scaling is what we call linear scalability, right? And what linear scalability is we want to scale in such a way that we don't lose productivity, right? Uh, it's a way of making sure that we maintain the productivity that we have as a single team, and we can carry that on as we start to implement more and more teams. Now, linear scalability can be very difficult to implement, as we know. The more process that we add, the more difficult it is to maintain the same level of productivity. So we want to watch out for lane scalability, but in order to really make sure we are tackling this linear scalability problem, we really have to look hard at the big challenges of our organization. And the first one, the next challenge I'm going to talk about is bureaucracy and hierarchy. I already threw out this term of minimal viable bureaucracy, but to me, this is one of the biggest challenges that we have when we do any sort of scaling or any sort of agile transformation is that teams and organizations don't want to tackle the big question of bureaucracy and hierarchy, right? We want to create more and more layers instead of reducing layers and minimalizing and decentralizing decision making to the teams as much as possible. So the first thing we have to do is tackle this bureaucracy and hierarchical problem that we have. And one of the ways that we can do that sometimes is by implementing what's called a Scrum of Scrum teams. This is a team of teams that has representatives from each of the teams that are working together, and that is this team of teams, or Scrum of Scrums, that is responsible for the coordination across many teams. Now, these Scrum of Scrum teams act as just like any other team. They will have a Scrum Master, they'll have a product owner, and they may even have team members on them that work across the multiple teams. And these Scrum Masters and product owners could be part of the original team, right? You don't need necessarily to have all new people filling these roles. People could be taking on these roles in addition to their normal roles on the team, or depending on how many teams you have or the complication, you could have individual people that work at this level. Now, Scrum of Scrum teams are very handy if you're going to implement Scrum of Scrums teams, then you're also going to want to implement a Scale Daily Scrum, where the Scrum of Scrum teams gets together and they discuss the challenges and impediments that each of the individual teams is having. This becomes a crucial coordination point, daily coordination point for the Scrum of Scrums teams to get together so they can coordinate and remove impediments at the team level. Now, one of the limiting factors of any implementation of scaling Scrum is your ability to remove impediments. How quickly can you remove impediments? It really does become the limiting factor. If teams have to wait more than a day or so to get impediments removed, their chance of success starts to decrease significantly. So it becomes this Scrum of Scrums team through this Scale Daily Scrum event to remove impediments as quickly as possible. Now, this can quickly start to grow, and you can have multiple teams working across multiple SOSs at the same time. You can see here that there's multiple sets of SOSs working across multiple teams and groups coordinating together. Each one of these might be its own product or its own platform, right? But so this can easily start to balloon if you're not careful. But we want to make sure that when we are ballooning this and that we start to scale out, that we maintain that minimal viable bureaucracy that we were talking about. All right, so the first thing that we do then is we create what's called an executive action team. Now, this is the team that is ultimately responsible to make sure that impediments are removed. So as we bring impediments from the individual teams every single day to the Scale Daily Scrum, we then, if the Scale Daily Scrum team event can't remove those impediments, we escalate those to the EAT team, right? To the executive action team. And it is their job then to make sure that impediments are removed as quickly as possible. Okay? Setting up these teams can be interesting challenge, but these people that sit on this executive action team should be empowered to remove any obstacles that a team may see. Generally speaking, this is management, senior management, and even C-suite members might actually sit on this EAT team because we need people that can make decisions quickly and allow the teams to move through those roadblocks that they see. The second grouping of teams that we would have, this EAT team sits on the Scrum cycle over here. So they are working on the daily work. They are working on the how side, how we are implementing it, how we remove impediments, how we build the processes that make sense for our organization. On the what side over here, which is what are we going to build? How are we going to prioritize things? How are we going to release things? We have a similar team on this side called the Executive MetaScrum. And what the Executive MetaScrum is it's similar to the EAT team, but it's a group of people, cross-functional people that work on creating a systematic backlog, prioritizing backlogs, creating release plans, determining strategic objectives, deciding what's the most important thing for the team to work on next. So this team, you could even think of it as a group of product owners, product managers, executives that are working on what are we going to build next, okay? This is why I like to use Scrum at Scale as a baseline because it creates two basically similar cycles. The how cycle, which is basically your Scrum cycle, your team's daily structures, how they are incorporating their work together via Scrum. And then we use that other cycle over here where the product owners use a very similar Scrum type cycle to coordinate their backlogs to create a consistent strategic plan, a consistent strategic vision. Once we can kind of get the team cycles working in place on the how side, and we can get the product backlogs working on the what side, then we can start to implement some more complicated implementations of the safe functionality and the nexus functionality and all of those other things. But basically getting your how and your what cycles down, to me, becomes the key underlying objective when we are working through developing a scale approach to creating this common playbook. Now, decision latency here is one of the hugest, like we talked about, getting decisions, getting latency out. Oh, this slide must have converted badly. But if we can reduce decision latency down to 1 hour or less, we have a 75% better chance. Organizations say they have 75% better chance of being successful. If we push that beyond, this is really bad read, this is 5 hours, our chance of success greatly reduces, you can see here. And the other challenge that we have is prioritization, right? And so we all know that we're building things that we shouldn't be building. We focus on the wrong things sometimes, and sometimes we just work on the things because the loudest person in the room is screaming. And this is something that scaled frameworks definitely address, right? The how side here is about decision latency on the Scrum Master side, and the prioritization then is on the what side or the product owner cycle side here. So we're underlying creating a strong foundation, a strong reference model of which we can work from by using Scrum at Scale as a base before we start to implement any of the more complicated versions of Scrum at Scale and SAFe and that kind of thing. All right. Now, one of the things that we need to do is we're going to need to know what are we going to tackle first, right? Yes, this all sounds super great. Well, we'll just create these teams, and then we'll do these things, and we'll create an executive action team and a MetaScrum team. But how are we going to know what our true underlying problems are in an organization? And one of the things that we do here at WebAge is we implement the Scrum at Scale heat maps approach. The heat maps have 4 mega issues. We talked about all of these, right? Prioritization, working product, organizational refactoring, and organizational culture. So first thing we do is we look at those different mega issues. We do some assessments. We allow the team to help assess. We look at management, and we decide where do you score on your heat map on your on these particular issues. This will then help us to address the ones that we need to address first. At the same time, when we're looking at your mega issues, we also look at these component issues that are out there. This should be a 14, I think one. Yeah, 14. Boy, this is what happens when you loan your deck to somebody and you don't look at it real close. There are 14 components. We also then, in addition to the mega issues, we look at the 14 different components and we start to address those and rank those so we can also determine where we need to put our focus first. And we do that by creating what's called this heat map that tells us where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. What do we want to focus on first in order to create a truly valid Scrum implementation at scale? Right? So we create these heat maps. These, just like any other retrospective item, we reevaluate consistently and often to make sure that we are addressing the right issues at the right time. At the end of every cycle, we would want to review the heat maps then and make sure that we can then tackle the correct thing at the correct time. All right. So here's a case study of an organization that I recently spent, well, I've spent since 2014. I've been working in this organization. They've chosen not to be identified, unfortunately, but they're a telecommunications platform in the Midwest. They have roughly 200 employees in their marketing, sales, and IT departments. So for the Midwest, it's a relatively mid-sized company, but they work with organizations that work with small cable companies and telephone companies and internet service providers. And as you can imagine, this market is quickly changing. As we all know, nobody uses cable television anymore, right? Phones are going away. Internet is becoming more prevalent. And this market has seen a huge shift since 2014. Players have begun to collapse together, to merge together in order to survive. Now, this particular organization I am working with constantly is, like I said, they are a medium-sized player in this market, and they have managed to survive, but they had some major changes, and the market has shifted down to just a few players. When I met with their executives back in 2014, they told me that this was the problems that they were having. They had a very much a lack of predictability. They couldn't tell their clients when certain things were going to be done. They couldn't tell them how much it was going to cost, right? There was a lot of missed deadlines. There was a lot of lack of accountability. They didn't know, was it the salespeople over delivering things, over promising things? Was it the tech team under delivering? Were the tech teams delivering the right things at the right time? And this was causing major problems in the organization. They could not take on any new clients because they couldn't deliver to the existing clients that they had. So as you can imagine, they saw this great opportunity coming of things that they could take advantage of in the market, but they couldn't take advantage of them because of their internal scaling issues that they had amongst the team. Okay. So they had about 4 teams that we decided to pilot with. And so then I met with the teams and I said to the teams, well, what are the challenges that you are seeing? We know what the management sees are the issues, the lack of accountability, lack of predictability, that kind of thing. And the teams told me that they didn't understand the vision of where the organization was going from moment to moment. They didn't think that they were aligned to any particular strategic vision, that the vision was also shifting from moment to moment, right? That each team had a lack of inconsistent process. Some teams were doing Scrum, some teams were doing waterfall, some teams were doing this whole made-up thing. And so coordinating across teams was very difficult. And they didn't have any line to the customer. So they couldn't speak directly to the customer. They were always speaking directly to a salesperson, and they were not sure they were getting the information that they needed correctly. Right? And most important here, the teams perceived that management just didn't care about the teams. They were throwing things over the fence, and then once it wasn't done, they would just blame the teams, and the teams perceived that management didn't care. Now, when I presented this feedback to management, of course, they said that wasn't true. You know how this goes, it was kind of a he said, she said kind of a thing. And so we set out to tackle this problem right away. The first thing we did was we implemented the Scrum process, right? We did basic Scrum training. We built a common playbook across all of the teams. We created cross-functional stable teams rather than siloed teams. We then began to standardize roles. We wanted to make sure that all Scrum Masters were doing it the same way. All product owners were doing things the same way, that the teams were working from the same playbook, right? We tried to get it right. We tried to nail it, right? We then established a common improvement, continuous improvement mindset. We wanted the teams to know that they were in charge of their destiny, that they could make any suggestions that they wanted that would improve process improvement. We wanted them to know that they could change wherever possible, and they could suggest change. Okay? We then created those Scrum of Scrum teams that got together daily to work through the issues. On the side of the trust problem that we were having with teams not trusting the management and management not trusting the teams, we then set up, we started to create a product owner cycle to address the trust cycle. And the way we did that is we established that MetaScrum team that I was mentioning before. So we had one group of people that were responsible for the overall strategic vision, for the overall prioritization. And it was this team's job then to make sure that the teams understood what they were doing and how it connected to what their strategic vision was. They met with the teams often. They met with the Scrum of Scrums teams often to make sure that they understood we are working on this because this is the strategic objective and this is how the customers were going to benefit. We also then opened up the line of communications between those groups and the customers. We allowed both the teams and the executive MetaScrum teams and the product owners to connect with the teams, to the customers whenever possible. Okay. We then created a backlog prioritization technique that we called MAC pointing, which was a way of pointing all of their epics. We decided early on that we needed to create some predictability, and we did not know how many work items a team could get done per quarter. So we broke our work down into epics. We pointed those epics, and then we would use those points to say, we know that our teams can get done X number of epic points per quarter. This allowed management then to take those and use for release planning. They could then start to say, well, our teams realistically can only get X number of points done. So let's not overcommit to our customers. Let's not overpromise things. Let's just do what our teams can get done. That way, we're not rushing our teams. We're not overpromising. And this created a common release planning cycle. And then we also created and established an escalation process that impediments could be escalated as quickly as possible and hopefully turned around and reduced within 1 hour to 1 day. That was our initial goal. Now you can see here, I created this little chart, our predictability ratio, which I we calculated as being the amount of work items that you forecasted to get done at the beginning of a sprint, as opposed to how many you completed. That's the ratio. You can see in the first few sprints of calculating these, the team did not do well, right? They were at a 34% 16, 28, 55. So they were not predictable at all. And this wasn't exactly sprint one. Also, we started calculating this many sprints in, but their predictability ratio here was bad. The team just couldn't figure out how to deliver on what they promised. And a lot of this had to do with the way the product owners were breaking down stories. It had a lot to do with the way they were forcing the teams to do work. So we started to address those issues. And you can see here then over time, the predictability ratio jumped from 71% to 81%. And I was just checking this out, that the team now is at about an 80 to 90% consistent on their predictability metric. So if they say they are going to get something done, the team now, after implementing Scrum at Scale, can get it done, which then makes them more predictable, which means the executives can now predict when they're going to get done. Now, one of the stars here is the team's velocity quickly stabilized right away. And we actually then saw a 30 to 50% increase within the first 6 months or so. So this team started delivering 50% more, which is huge. A 20% gain in efficiency, 40% gain in efficiency is huge. But more importantly, our predictability increased by 70%. Our ability for the teams and the scaled teams to say, we will get something done and we'll get it done on the deadline when we say as a team we'll get it done, increased by 70%, which was huge. Right? This allowed the company to start to be able to go out and sell things. It allowed them to be able to sell things in an effective manner and to then deliver on what they promised. It turned out that their customers were not necessarily concerned about when it was going to get delivered. They were just more concerned on doing it when they were said they would get it done, right? So if you said you were going to get it done at the first of the month, that's great. But if you said you were going to get it done on the first of the month and you didn't get it done for 3 more months, that's bad. So we were just really looking for the predictability. That was phase 1 of our scale. Once we got that done and we got the EAT team established in our executive MetaScrum team, now we have started to move into phase 2, where we are trying to now speed up our time to market. We have started to implement parts of SAFe, like big room planning, big room retrospectives, strategic planning, system thinking, design thinking, right? All of these things now are coming in phase 2. So we built a foundation using Scrum at Scale, and now we are going back and adding in the good components of SAFe and I primarily use SAFe and less. There's a lot of overlap there. So this is how we have used Scrum at Scale at WebAge to help our clients to get better. You'll also be able to look at that Rocket Mortgage study, how Jeff Sutherland has used Scrum at Scale, and he also uses SAFe to help in a larger organization to implement a scaled framework. Now, if you're interested in more information on Scrum at Scale and how you can use it as a base, I'm going to drop one last file. This is the official Scrum at Scale guide that you can download and look at and take a look at. And if you have any questions, I'm available. We have 5 more minutes here. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. Here are your thoughts. Remember, you can take yourself off mute. Tell me, do you have scaled implementations that are working? What's working for you? Do you have scaled implementations that are not working? What are your challenges? Please, let's hear from you. Let's have an open discussion. Anybody have some thoughts? Or you can drop it into the questions. Scaling can be an interesting challenge. Remember, don't scale if you don't have to. That's one of the things that we learned I've learned very early on is a lot of teams think they need to scale. A lot of organizations think they need to scale because of the buzzword. They think they're a large organization. That means they have to scale. And oftentimes, and many times, that is not the case. What you actually need to do is descale, reorganize your teams, think about how you're doing work, think about your process, think about your bureaucracy, and reduce all of that first before you start to tackle scaling. All right, so I will be around for about 5 more minutes. I'd love to hear from you. Like I said, you can take yourself off mute, or you can drop a question or a comment in the question section. Otherwise, I appreciate all your time. If you would like to get more information, you can always reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide you with more information. Thank you, everybody, and have a great and safe holiday.